Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 57th episode of the Writ Podcast. The fall political season is looking to be an important one for the government. They're going to have a new opposition leader across the aisle pretty soon. There's a Quebec election happening. There's the minority parliament. We're still in a minority parliament. There's a deal with the NDP. So there's a lot to discuss about what the Liberals need to do in this fall session. So I'm joined today by Dan Arnold. He's the Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara. He also worked as the Director of Research and Advertising in the Prime Minister's office, and he polled for the Liberals over the last three election campaigns. So Dan, welcome back to the podcast.
Always happy to join you on the Writ, Eric.
So I want to start with just a broader view about where things stand right now, because it is now 7 years that the government has been in power, which is a long time for any government. It's been a pretty tumultuous couple of years. It just does seem that ever since Donald Trump was elected, it's been one crisis after another, the latest being the pandemic. That seems to be now receding, at least in terms of the government's kind of emergency approach to it. It's obviously still a problem they have to handle. But what is the kind of climate that the Liberals are in terms of the public opinion? How do people see the government? But also just what the mood is of the country with a government that's been in power for 7 years.
Yeah, and I mean, what I would say here, and this is probably going to sound sacrilegious on this podcast, is I would not pay a lot of attention to the horse race polls at this stage in the game, especially when the Conservatives are in a bit of this nebulous situation where we know who the next leader is going to be, but the public may not necessarily be aware of that, and they may not have formed an opinion of the new leader. And if you ask them a survey with Candace Bergen's name on it, unless you are a political junkie or a big Murphy Brown fan, that name's not going to mean anything to you. And then if you don't include a leader name, are you asking about Poilievre? Are you not asking about Poilievre? So I would just kind of throw the horse race stuff out, and I'd probably pay more attention to questions about how people feel about the Prime Minister, how they feel about the government, and some of those fundamentals that you mentioned right there, which I think are very much realities this government has to contend with. Voters like Vulcans have that 7-year itch, and you start to get that mood for a change that comes up at this stage in the life of any government. I think that is a truism in politics that has always existed, and something this government certainly has to contend with, just like every other government who is lucky enough to make it this far. And I think the big challenge they're facing right now, I mean, you've mentioned some of the challenges they faced in the past with Trump and COVID. The big challenge right now is clearly inflation, right? And I think, Pollara, we just actually put out a poll this week that showed that only 1 in 6 Canadians feel that their wages are keeping up with inflation. There's a lot of anxiety about that out there right now, and I think, inflation and economic uncertainty that comes with it is something that is always a difficult situation for any government. And I think, this is a challenge that's a little bit different than most past ones the government has faced. And, they've definitely got to handle this issue well, or else that could be another big problem for them heading into the fall, I think.
You said, lucky to be in power for 7 years. There's been a lot of discussion about whether a fourth election is something that Trudeau can win, that because no one has done it since, I think, Wilfrid Laurier was the last one the Prime Minister to win 4 consecutive elections. Something that I've thought about is that, when you're thinking about someone like Laurier, and obviously someone, we think about Laurier a lot, four consecutive elections means 16 years, right? But this has been a minority scenario. Do you think that the amount of time matters more than the amount of time people have voted?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, we just don't have a big enough data set to maybe do the full regression analysis on that. I think it's something that is a feel, as if everything in politics. Like if you feel like I'm just tired of this government, and that probably is more a product of time than the number of times you have voted in an election campaign. That said, though, it does feel like we all aged 20 years during COVID. So they saw the Prime Minister out there every day, right, for at least a year. So, I mean, that was a lot of exposure, and that builds up and takes its toll as well, too. I think that time for a change sentiment is something the government's going to have to contend with. That said, I think, we talk about records of Prime Ministers and Premiers running for a fourth election, records of Prime Ministers and Premiers who pass the baton off to somebody else and they run for a fourth election, also not a great track record in that situation. So, I think it's not a given that the Liberals would be in better hands with anybody else going into the next election campaign. And, I think that's something all the pundits will obviously chatter about, and I heard you talking about it on your podcast last week as well, too. But I think, that's something certainly that the Prime Minister himself is going to have to give some thought to in terms of who is that best person to kind of take the party into the next campaign.
Well, what would be the considerations there? So if, there's obviously the personal ones, and that's just a decision that is made at the personal level, whether you would just want to do it for the next 4 years. But if he was looking at the situation, what would be what he would take into account? What kind of numbers would, your successor would be providing him that would inform the kind of decision about whether he is helping or hurting the party?
Yeah, I mean, and there's obviously a lot of different polling questions you can ask to these ends, but I think the ultimate questions you need to answer is, who is going to motivate and excite Liberal voters to actually turn out in an election campaign when they are, going for a fourth mandate? Who is somebody who can excite Canadians, more broadly speaking, and connect with voters? Like, who has that actual ability to connect with real people and show that they understand what they're going through in a tough, challenging economic situation, and who can go toe to toe with Poilievre in an election campaign and actually stand up to him in a debate and on the campaign trail, and has that that spark to take on what is a very formidable opponent. So I think I think the Prime Minister has shown he can do all those things in past election campaigns. So I think he has those skills, and I think with somebody else it's a bit of a maybe question there. You don't know if they have those skills or not. So I think those are all definitely considerations that will go into a decision whenever that decision happens.
Does the deal with the NDP change any of the thinking for the next couple of years for the government? If they were just in a minority, just working on a case-by-case basis, does it change the way that they have to approach the NDP, for one? Because if it was more of a brinksmanship kind of thing, that relationship is a bit more contentious. But here, there is almost a bit of the New Democrats want to be seen that they're still part of this, right? That they still have some sway. And it feels like a delicate balancing act for the Liberal government to keep themselves in power, keep the NDP happy enough, but not too happy that, they get the benefit.
Yeah, I think like we all recognize that deal was not signed in blood, and realities of the day will impact it in the long run. Though I think at the same time, from an NDP perspective, like if the Liberals are too high in the polls, you don't want to cause an election. If they're doing too bad and it looks like the Conservatives will win, you don't necessarily want that situation either, because then you lose your influence. So, what is that sweet spot that would actually cause the NDP to want to back out? I don't know. I don't think there's really any interest on the Liberal side of cutting that deal short. I think, we talked off the top about, it's been Trump, and then it's been COVID, and one crisis after another, and I do feel like the government looked at this third mandate and looks at this third mandate as an opportunity to actually get some of these things done that they've really been itching to get done, or that they've laid a lot of the groundwork to get done, and finally get those boil water advisories lifted, get some of these environmental measures, get the trees planted, get the emissions levels going down, roll out some of the housing measures that were talked about in the last campaign. And I think they would appreciate having that stability for a couple of years to actually push some of these things out the door and actually get all the change that has been starting to happen actually seen more broadly by the public. Because I think I think electorally too, like if the public actually sees results and sees things happening, and progressives see that the government has sort of fulfilled a lot of those broad promises, big ambitious things that they've been talking about, and actually sees results there, I think that certainly serves the Liberals well electorally in the next election campaign for sure. It undercuts a bit of that all talk narrative that the NDP was pushing out last campaign, that I think probably did have a lot of traction and has some traction with those progressive voters. So I think having 3 more years hopefully to get results on all these issues would be something that the government would certainly value and would hope to see happen.
I know it's been a while since the agreement has been signed, so we've already heard everybody's opinions about it, but I am curious about yours. In terms of the discussion that took place when the agreement was signed, in the chattering classes about whether the Liberals were abandoning the centre. From your perspective, is there more to gain by delivering on what could be seen as NDP priorities rather than trying to occupy the centre more fully?
Yeah, I'm a fan of the agreement just because I think again it gives that stability, stability in quotation marks for those listening. But at least it raises the threshold for causing an election campaign. It makes an election less likely, I think, at the very least. And again, I think the government, their pathway to victory, putting right or left aside, their pathway to getting another mandate is going to be seen as like actually having gotten things done for people that matter and impact their lives. And I think you're able to do that if you have a bit more runway and a bit more time at your disposal to get those things done. And I think if they can actually go to the electorate next campaign and actually show some tangible outcomes, that is the pathway to getting another government, another mandate. And I think the agreement makes that more likely. And I mean, right or left, I think there's probably still more votes on that kind of like progressive liberal NDP overlap than on that kind of liberal conservative overlap. But at the same time, it's not like centrist voters hate dental care with a fiery passion or anything like that. There are going to be much broader issues that the government is going to have to contend with. And nothing in this agreement precludes the government from how they deal with other financial issues or other economic issues or other issues that could be relevant to some of those liberal conservative overlap voters there. So I think in terms of the policy conditions that are on the deal, it seems like stuff that would be broadly popular with Canadians as a whole, and certainly with progressives. And I think the big mushy part of the voter pool out there for Liberals is still largely on that kind of progressive side of the flank there. So I think that's a group you want to make sure they see results, and again, that they see the boil water advisories lifted, they see trees being planted, they see these things that matter to them actually happening, and hopefully gives the government runway to do that, and to also deal with the big issues like inflation, right? Like if you're not worried about an election campaign, you can probably deal with these bigger issues better than you can if you have to survive vote to vote in the House of Commons. So if it gives them more runway to do some of the big things that matter to all Canadians across the political spectrum, I think it's a good deal for the government. Bad deal for you because that's one less election campaign to cover, but for those of us who are tired of election campaigns, probably a good thing.
Yeah, no, we don't like this. It should be in the States. You have an election every 2 years. I'm not sure that's a better solution. Anyway, we'll move on to the Conservatives because so this is the third leadership race we've had in a little while, and so since you first went to work with the PMO, this is the third one that you've been seeing from that perspective. And I know that we haven't heard a lot of discussion from Liberals about what's happening in the Conservative leadership race. They're kind of leaving it to kind of germinate on its own. But, we heard stories about when it was 2017, what Liberal insiders or staffers were hoping who would win, that, Bernier would be easy to beat or whatever it was. So now you've got a larger set of data set of Conservative leadership races. How do you find this one differs from the other two, and particularly from the perspective of the Liberals?
Well, at least you're getting Conservative leadership races every 2 years to cover, so that's the positive there. It's an interesting race to watch. Very high-profile candidates, at least at the start of the campaign, who all kind of tacked differently in terms of their strategies and message. So, as an outsider, I find that, just someone who likes politics, very interesting to watch and sort of see how that unfolds. Look, I think the membership numbers are staggering and incredibly impressive in terms of the number of people that have signed up. And I think it really does speak to Poilievre's ability to really connect with the psyche of the Conservative base. And I think that's certainly to his credit, and that makes him a very formidable opponent in the next election campaign. He's proven now in a bit more of a test laboratory that leadership races are, that he has the ability to connect with people and to get his message out as an effective communicator and to kind of tap into the anxieties of voters. Now, it's going to be a different subset of voters, obviously, in a general election, but I think his raw skills are very impressive, and I've definitely taken that home as a key take-home from this campaign, whereas the last leadership race, Peter MacKay kind of started as the front runner and really kind of floundered through that race and didn't run a great campaign, and we saw the result of it. Lesson from the Conservative leadership races. I mean, look what's likely going to happen to Charest this time, what happened to MacKay last time, what happened to the Lisa Rates of the world, and Aaron O'Toole back when he ran as a progressive in 2017 in the leadership race. They were all kind of left by the side of the road there. And I think, I look at this party and it seems like it's hard to see a scenario where a red Tory comes in and becomes the next leader of this party, because the base just seems to be very much still in that reform side of the tent post-merger. Even Harper beat Stronach and Clement, right? So I think it certainly looks to me like that party is still being very much pulled by its base, which is still very much the reform base from kind of the pre-merger entities there.
If you were, you had the budget and you had the mandate from the party, what would you be testing right now? What would you be seeing in public opinion about this race?
Look, I think at this point you'd be testing about Poilievre, because I think the race is over for all intents and purposes. So I think, at this stage in the game, the important thing from a Liberal perspective is to understand, when you take Poilievre from that kind of like Conservative base and put him in front of the broader electorate, how do they feel about him? What do they like? What do they not like about him, just as a person, just as a politician? What from his tone, from his style, what rubs them the right way, what rubs them the wrong way, and just kind of get a sense of how he plays with the broader electorate and what they're going to think about him once they start getting a bit more exposure to him in the fall.
What do you think are some of his? What does he bring to the Conservatives that the Liberals should be concerned about that they might not have been as concerned about with Aaron O'Toole or Andrew Scheer?
Yeah, I think Scheer and O'Toole, I think before the election campaign started, were pretty much non-entities. I think it would be safe to say, in the eyes of Canadians as a whole. And part of that was just because there was things like COVID going on that made it hard for O'Toole to get traction. But I think it's fair to say that the Liberals could largely just ignore Scheer and O'Toole for all intents and purposes until you got into an election campaign. And obviously, when you got into an election campaign, we had to highlight the social conservative side of Scheer and the guns positions of O'Toole, and you had to take your shots there. But I think before the election campaign, there wasn't that need, because they were afterthoughts in the eyes of Canadians. I have a hard time believing that Pierre Poilievre is going to be an afterthought. He just seems like such a strong personality. The media is going to be interested in him. He's proven that he can get his message out to hundreds of thousands of people via social media. He's going to say things that are going to catch attention and excite people both positively and negatively. So, I don't think the Liberals can ignore him. I think they do have to kind of take him head on and look for those opportunities there to draw the contrast with him and highlight positions that he has that are less appealing to the broader public, or mistakes that he's made. I think he's going to say other things down the road. I don't think he's going to pivot to the center. So I think he's going to say things that are controversial. I think there'll be lots of opportunities that present themselves in the next couple of years to do that. In the short term, I think the Bitcoin comments strike me as an example of something that was clearly poor judgment on his part. If his whole credibility is based on I've got an answer for inflation and these guys don't understand inflation, your solution for inflation is cash in your life savings and put them in a risky online investment that lost half its value after 2 months if you'd followed my advice, that's not a great solution for inflation either, and I think that undercuts his economic credentials. So I think there'll be other things like that will pop up over time, and I think the Liberals certainly have to pounce on those opportunities when they present themselves, because I don't think they can just wait for the next election campaign, whenever that is, and unload the Oppo cannon at that point, because I think he's somebody who's not going to be a wallflower for the next couple of years, it's safe to say.
So it's not exactly like with O'Toole, it was more about, some of the, it was the gun stuff that you mentioned, but also just that, saying one thing and then doing having a different position. With Scheer, it was more the social conservative stuff, and he also had some authenticity issues by the end. I can't believe that campaign ended on insurance brokers and American
Secret
citizenship.
American.
Yeah. Anyway, shows you that campaigns are really about the issues. But what would it be here? Is it because his position on those issues is different than Andrew Scheer? Obviously, he's not anti-choice or anything like that. And with guns, we haven't really heard him talk much about it. But I assume that his position is not going to be all that different from Aaron O'Toole's. But can that be recycled, or is it going to have to be something different? What is his kind of thing that can stick to him?
Yeah, I think that's what people are going to have to find. I think, like Bitcoin's an example of something. I think, he's certainly cozied up to the convoy crowd, maybe at a level that would not be, would not make a lot of centrist voters that comfortable. But again, there's also, he's going to, I don't think he's going to pivot. I don't think he's going to pivot to the middle. I think he's going to continue to make bold statements and strong statements, and some of those will be popular and some of those will not. And I think it's a matter of kind of finding the ones that are not and pouncing on them. I think, clearly ideologically he is a true blue conservative that O'Toole, said he was, and then kind of backtracked from a little bit down the road. So I think, he's gonna do things that people who are not true blue conservatives might find a little bit unpleasant at times. And I think, it's just a matter of making sure that the government capitalizes on them when those things happen. I think, again, in the short term, I think Bitcoin's a good issue to go on. But I think there'll be other things that kind of present themselves over time. And, ultimately, it's probably going to, in 3 years from now, we don't know what the issues are going to be. But I think, there's a decent chance it could come down to I'm going to cut government versus government can do these things. And that's largely what liberal conservative fights often kind of hinge on. And, in a couple of years from now, if we're through this kind of high inflation period, it wouldn't surprise me if that kind of is, again, the axis that it boils down to. But I guess we'll wait and see.
Is there something about Poilievre's message that should make the Liberals worried? Something that he's hitting on that the Liberals aren't as effective at countering?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Poilievre, from just a, tactics perspective, has shown these long form videos seem to work. It seems to be an effective way for him to get his message across and to connect with people. So I think he's shown that is something that is a new tool, not a new tool, but a tool that he's using better than other politicians have. And I think just from a message perspective, he's done a good job at sort of diagnosing the anxieties of Canadians, be it on, prices in the diner going up or housing prices, houses that you want becoming unaffordable, things like that matter to people. And he's giving them solutions. I mean, I personally think his solutions are kind of pulled from thin air and not necessarily A to B, but he presents them in a way that makes them certainly seem very believable. And I think gets a lot of traction with that respect. And I think he is, obviously in a leadership race, he does, you sort of drift off into the World Economic Forum conspiracies and things like that. But I do think he, by and large, has tried to focus a bit on the economic issues and issues like inflation. I mentioned some polling that we did at Pollara recently. On that survey, 2/3 of Canadians think inflation is going to get worse in the next couple of months. 2/3 think it's going to be at least a year till we're out of this high inflation period we're in. So, heading into the fall, the public certainly still sees inflation as being a big concern and something they are worried about, even if the expert opinion is that maybe it has peaked. And I think, in that environment where people are very worried and think this is going to get worse, so they don't see the government offering solutions, and he's coming along and offering a solution that at least, sounds plausible, even if it isn't, that is very potent in politics. And you give people someone to blame, you give them a solution, that's what you want to do in politics. And he's shown he can do that quite effectively. So I think he's, if he's hitting on those themes in the fall, as opposed to some of the more fringe conservative base conspiracy theory sort of things, or caressing wood in his videos, or doing things like that. If he's actually focusing on economic issues, I think, and inflation, I think he's has the potential to certainly get a lot of traction.
Let's move on to we'll just finish with a quick chat on the Quebec election, which is going to get started on Sunday officially. First of all, I have a personal question, not personal, but I'm always curious about how that relationship between federal and provincial parties, what the relationship is. In some provinces, it's very, very close. Ontario Liberals and federal Liberals, lots of the same kind of people. Same thing in Atlantic Canada. But in Quebec, if you're a federal Liberal and you're part of the federal Liberal apparatus, I'm not saying that you're just a person who votes Liberal, how do you view a provincial election in Quebec?
Yeah, I think it's important just because the Premier of Quebec has such a high level of influence on the national stage. So even putting aside any kind of like partisan overlap there, who the Premier of Quebec is going to have huge ramifications in terms of just the issues that get pushed to the forefront that you're going to have to deal with, that you're going to have to respond to. So I think it's something that the government would look at quite closely in terms of paying attention to it. And there are going to be a kind of like at a human level, there's definitely going to be people who are working in the Trudeau government now who worked for the Quebec Liberals and know people there, and there's going to be a bit of overlap there. But I think the reality is, this is another election that looks a bit like a fait accompli at this time. So I don't know if necessarily there would be a lot of necessarily behind the scenes, even back and forth there. It's more kind of paying attention, seeing what Legault is talking about, and making sure that the issues that he's raising in the campaign, those are the issues you're probably going to have to deal with down the road. And I think everybody in Ottawa in the current government is probably going to be paying a lot of attention to what Legault says on the campaign trail, because those are things you might have to deal with in a couple of months.
What are your thoughts on the campaign as a whole? Just in terms of the mood of Quebecers, the strength of the CAQ in the polls, the Liberals having some trouble. What are you expecting? I know you just said it. It looks like Legault is probably going to end up winning it. But just in terms of the mood of Quebecers, what this election kind of signifies.
Yeah, I think if you look at the Ontario election, Ford benefited from that Liberal NDP vote being perfectly split. But I think he always had the risk that Liberal and NDP voters in Ontario are very similar, and they could coalesce behind one of those two parties. There was always that kind of threat to him there. Based on the polls right now, like Legault is facing a four-way split of the opposition, so none of the parties have maybe 20% most in some polls, but very little support. And it's hard to find four more different parties than like the Quebec Liberals and the PQ and Quebec Solidaire and the Quebec Conservatives. Like there's not a lot of Liberal PQ swing voters, I'd imagine, or Solidaire conservative swing voters there. So it's even hard to kind of imagine a scenario where that opposition vote coalesces behind any one party in particular. And then, I think that obviously leaves Legault in a very enviable position heading into that campaign. And then on top of that, I think, Quebecers are in a pretty good mood. We've actually got some polling coming out at Pollara next week on how angry Canadians are about different topics. We call it the Rage Index. So it's how angry about government and the economy and stories in the news and things like that. And right now, Quebecers and British Columbians are the least angry about their provincial government, which is obviously good if you're a government running for re-election. But just beyond that, too, like Quebecers just seem less worked up right now about their financial situation, about the changes that are happening in the country, the stories in the news. So you've got an electorate in Quebec that is relatively content compared to elsewhere in the country, where I think there is a lot of frustration kind of bubbling up below the surface on a lot of different files there. So if you're a government running for your second mandate and people are pretty happy and the opposition is fractured in many different directions, like that adds up to a pretty good electoral calculus, I think, for the incumbent.
But we'll finish on this. What do you think the results will mean for Justin Trudeau? Probably means another 4 years of François Legault. He doesn't have an election coming up. How will the results impact the federal government, do you think?
Yeah, I think it really depends, I guess, how aggressive Legault wants to be on some of these issues around identity, around language, or Quebec's role in Canada. But I think, you're looking ahead to the next couple of years. You've got, Legault in Quebec, likely. Ford is certainly at times has butted heads with the federal government. He's worked with them too at times. So, we don't know what that relationship's going to look like, but there's certainly the potential for conflict there. Potentially Daniel Smith coming in Alberta in the fall, talking about issues like sovereignty and overturning the constitutional rule of law. Like there's a lot of these provincial issues that certainly could be bubbling up to the surface in the coming months. And I think that's something that we may not be thinking about right now as issues that could be on your podcast in 6 months from now that everyone will be talking about because voters are tuned into them. We're all assuming it's going to be inflation, but in a couple months from now, some of these other issues around the Federation, definitely could be things that are getting a lot of oxygen with the public, and dealing with angry premiers is something that is the job of any prime minister. He may have some particularly feisty premiers looking to to create issues in the coming months. So I think that's something definitely to keep an eye on.
All right, I lied. I have one question, just more because you brought it up. I know you know Alberta very well. Do you think it'll be Danielle Smith?
Look, I mean, the people I talk to think it'll be Danielle Smith, and everybody's talking about her right now. There have been a lot of surprises in Alberta leadership races, though, in recent times. So I wouldn't say anything is a given at the moment right now, but certainly that seems to be the chatter on the ground out there, is that it's looking like she is certainly. We talked about the conservative base federally. Like the conservative base in Alberta is even more extreme, I'd say, in a lot of these views, and certainly she has tapped into that during this leadership campaign.
Yeah, so a sovereignist premier in Alberta rather than Quebec. That'll be the result of the of the voting that's going to take place in October.
It looks like that could be the case.
All right, well then that's going to be probably a pretty interesting thing that the government's going to have to tackle as well. So Dan, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast to give us your thoughts on all of this.
Well, I'm happy to come here. I mean, we didn't have a lengthy discussion on Justin Trudeau's haircut, which I was expecting we were going to get into. But beyond that, I think we have covered all of the important issues of the day and the issues of federation. So happy to discuss them.
All right. Thanks so much.
Talk to you later.